Hello, my name is Andrew Gomison, and it is my privilege to be with you again today for the Culture Watch podcast. This podcast is a podcast outreach of Speaking for Him, and I'm so glad that you've joined me. The reason that this podcast exists is because I believe firmly that we need to have a biblical worldview and that it needs to color the way we look at current events and the political things that are going on around us. We have a unique opportunity in the United States of America to make decisions for our own political future and to respond in a biblical way to the current events that we are facing so that people can be, Lord willing, directed to Jesus Christ, who is the light of the world. And so I'm grateful that you are here, and I hope that this episode will serve as an inspiration or encouragement to you on the journey that we call the Christian life, and that if so, you will share it with your family and friends. That's how more people find out about what I am doing as Speaking for Him, and I would be truly grateful if you would do that. Well, I am so thankful for everyone who contributes to this ministry. I just have to give a praise report that over $1,300 have been raised toward my manual wheelchair, and my ultimate goal is $5,500. So if you are so moved to donate toward a manual wheelchair for me, I explained a little bit more about that in last week's episode. So if you want more details, you can go back to that episode and learn more. But if you have any questions, you can contact me with the contact information that's about to roll at the end of the show. I would be glad to fill you in. With that being said, let's jump into news for the week of August 24. So we continue to be in primary mode in the United States, and so I want to start out today by talking about Byron Donalds and his great victory in the Republican primary for the governor's race in Florida.
Fox News Alert, Byron Donalds speaking live in Florida right now after clinching the Republican nomination for governor. Let's listen in.
We've been crisscrossing Florida. We've been knocking hundreds of thousands of doors, taking our message to all Floridians. And tonight, because of your sweat, because of your hard work, we have won a massive victory. Now, we've just come through a hard-fought primary. I got a call from Paul Renner and James Fishback tonight. And they, hold on, I'm going to tell you why in a moment. And they congratulated me and all of us on a hard-fought victory. And my conversation with both of them is very simple. Congratulations. Let's go beat David Jolly in November. You see, because individual opinions and passionate supporters are the beauty of our conservative movement. But tonight, the primary is over. Tonight, we put aside our differences. Tonight, we are one united Republican Party. You see, I remember Erica and I were sitting around a fire pit last year with friends, and we were talking about this campaign, and we were talking about the future of Florida. No matter the issue or the policy, the conversation always ended with us talking about the Florida dream. For us, it's personal. You know my story. I came to Florida 30 years ago on a Greyhound bus. At 17 years old, with just a trunk full of clothes, I arrived in Tallahassee. When Erica and I got married, it wasn't always easy. Our first apartment was 1,200 square feet, and it had those old Jalowsi windows. We didn't have the money for the security deposit, so we had to roll that into our rent. I worked at Cracker Barrel and moved furniture on the weekends just to make ends meet. Erica was 6 months pregnant with our first son, and she worked full-time as a staff accountant while working for Kelly Services on the weekend. We did this to build a life for our family. This state gave me a chance.
So I've been impressed with Byron Donalds for quite a while. I'm not sure if I learned about him before or after he was lieutenant governor. My guess is that I learned about him first after he was already lieutenant governor. But he is a very bold, eloquent, outspoken man. The role of lieutenant governor is traditionally very unheralded, and unlike the vice president, it doesn't usually put you in a good place to become the next governor of your state. But Byron Donalds is so eloquent and well-spoken that he has had many opportunities to show who he is and to eloquently express his views on many important issues. And so he has caught the nation's eye, in no small part because of the success of Florida under the direction of current Governor Ron DeSantis. So I have no doubt that Byron Donalds will serve the state of Florida well, and hopefully he will aspire to greater office. I really think he could be in the U.S. Senate or even in the presidency someday because he really loves America. And one of the things that I like about this clip is he talks about coming to Tallahassee with nothing. He talks about working hard because of the dreams that he and his wife had to set up a life for themselves. And this is something that I've been talking to you for the last 2 years since I started this podcast about. That the dream of America is that you can come here and make whatever it is you want of yourself, that there's no policies or regiments keeping you down, that you just have to stay motivated and stay interested in making your life better, but that the motivation for doing so should be bringing glory to the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I am a first-class example of how the American dream does not mean that there aren't challenges. I have said many times on this podcast that I would love to be working full-time and making a regular living either at this ministry or at an outside job, which I was perfectly willing to work. But a lot of those opportunities have not materialized to be good enough to allow me to be able to do that. But that does not mean that I want government programs to put a cap on what I'm able to accomplish. You know, I've seen a lot of posts lately about disabled people complaining about how hard it is to get benefits and how the benefits are inadequate. And I'm sure for many people that is the case. And I would say that if my whole goal was to live off disability benefits, I would wholeheartedly agree. There are problems with the disability benefit system. It is broken. And if you want me to share that with you in greater detail, you can go back to previous episodes where I've opened up about it, or you can send me a message. I'd be more than willing to talk to you about how I feel about it and about how there can be possible solutions. But every time I see a post about how disability benefits are lacking, the biggest thing that goes through my mind is, I don't want you to give me better disability benefits. What I want you to do is to believe in me as an employee and to help me get the opportunity that allows me to get off disability benefits and to never use them again. Because it is my position that I would much rather have a hand up than a hand out. And the way the disability system is set up right now, and the way so many government systems are set up right now, is that they're a hand out. There are people who lost their SNAP benefits during a crackdown by the Trump administration earlier this year, who said that they were on for 20 years and that it wasn't fair that their benefits were being reduced or that the things they were able to do with them were being more regulated. They were very disgruntled about it. But as far as I understand, SNAP benefits, aka food stamps, to be, they're supposed to be a temporary help until you get on your feet. So why do we have so many people walking around acting like this is a permanent solution? This is why it's important to have people like Byron Donalds in leadership, because Byron Donalds knows what it's like to have nothing and to work hard to have what he has. Now, this is another disconnect we have in this country, is that when you look at a rich person, particularly if you are a poor Democrat, you look at a rich Republican and you say to yourself, they don't deserve to be rich. Instead of looking into their story and maybe finding out that they used to be poor like you, but they put their nose to the grindstone and made something of their life. And this is the biggest thing that I want to put forth, that America gives us the opportunity to make something of ourselves. Now, equal opportunity does not equal outcome. As I said, my story is a perfect example of that. I wish my outcome was a lot better. But trust me when I say that socialism will not solve this problem. I have been part of the socialism light system of disability benefits since I was 18 years old. That is 29 years. And I have found this system to be severely lacking. Not to mention, I believe that the disability system encourages job search programs for the disabled to be less aggressive than they would be under normal circumstances to find jobs. I have literally been offered part-time jobs that are below my skill level, and if I were to accept them, the job program I was in would say, guess what, we can sign off that we found this guy a job, even though it doesn't adequately meet my needs in the least. So I know that might seem like a rant that I didn't plan on going on, but I think it's very important for us to think about, what does hard work produce in America? And hard work produces people like Byron Donalds, who came to Tallahassee on a bus with nothing and now is 3 months away from potentially being the governor of his state. And I love that story. I love the fact that he worked hard and made something of himself. And if I can encourage you one thing today, it would be that you can work hard and make something of yourself. But it's also not about making something of ourselves so much as it is about glorifying God with whatever platform we are given. So that if God allows you to make something of yourself and allows you to have some notoriety or a certain level of fame, that you will use that opportunity to influence people for good, and most importantly, to share Jesus Christ with them. When I was a teenager, I got many opportunities to share my testimony at Hope Network when my uncle did sensitivity training as these people were coming in, and some were working with disabled people for the very first time. And I always shared my story, and I told people that my story was his story, because my story was only possible through Jesus. Well, as we move on to the next story that I have today, this pertains more to my local audience, and I don't know how many people listen outside of Michigan, but we have a very important Senate race in the state of Michigan this year, with Abdul El Sayed going up against Mike Rogers. And I have to say that I've been very concerned about this race. Now, obviously, God is in control, but I'm very concerned because Abdul Sayed is a socialist. And as I've already elucidated as a part of this first story, socialism sounds good in practice, but in theory, it doesn't really work. And it's also very important to me that we get a conservative into the Senate, because we have not had a conservative representative in the U.S. Senate in 30 years. Well, I saw this clip on YouTube just the other day about how this election seems to be going as we march on toward November, and I thought it was very important to consider.
$1994. I'm sure many of you remember that year, 1994. It was the year of the Gingrich Revolution, when the Republicans gained 54 seats in the House and picked up 8 seats in the Senate, giving the Republicans control of the House for the first time in 40 years. It was an absolute Democrat bloodbath. But one of those 8 Senate seats was in Michigan, when the Republican Spencer Abraham, you may remember him, he cruised to victory on the coattails of that massive electoral landslide. Unfortunately, it was short-lived. Abraham went on to serve only a single term before losing to Debbie Stabenow back in 2000. And ever since then, for over 25 straight years, Michigan's 2 Senate seats have been locked up tight by the Democrats. That is until now. Analysts are openly admitting to their shock that Republican Senate drought in Michigan appears to be coming to an end. We're looking at nothing short of a polling earthquake for the Wolverine state. And this is something just nobody imagined we would be seeing in the August leading up to the midterms. Take a look at this. These are the last 5 Michigan Senate polls, and they are all showing the exact same thing, all from different pollsters. The Republican Mike Rogers is crushing it. Look at the latest from Fox News polls. Fox News has Rogers up 51-47. That's a 4-point lead, which you just saw Harry Enton talking about on CNN. Now, keep in mind, Fox News polls generally are, I would say they belong in the toilet, but that's an insult to toilets. And the reason for that is they are notoriously left-wing. They never show the Republican ahead. Never. In head-to-heads, it's always the left. I don't know why Fox farms out their polling to some left-wing outlet, but they've been doing it for years. For whatever reason, Fox News actually has the Republican ahead. That itself is newsworthy. Epic MRA, a pollster that's been surveying Michigan races for decades, very accurate. They have Rogers ahead by 3 points, 46-43. SoCal Strategies has it tighter. Rogers is up 42-41. Mitchell Research has it dead even at 45 each. Again, that itself is a victory given Michigan's track record. And then there's the Glenn Gariff Group. Now, if you don't know them, they are a Lansing, Michigan-based polling firm. They're the regular pollster for the Detroit News and WDIV-TV Channel 4. Can you see it? They have Rogers. Again, this is a Michigan polling firm. They have Rogers with an astounding 10-point lead, 49-39. Now, any one of these polls alone would be astonishing in its own right. Any single one of them, even the tied one, shouldn't be happening in Michigan. And it's not just for the fact that it's a Michigan Senate poll, which should be decisively in favor of the Democrat, given that Michigan hasn't elected a Republican to the Senate in 30 years.
So the first thing I want to say about this clip is I didn't play this because I take a huge amount of stock in poll. The reason that I played this was because the fact that 5 separate polls that skew Democratic are saying that Mike Rogers is coming out on top in a very big way is encouraging to me, because I have concerns about a socialist being in the Senate for the state of Michigan. And I'm gratified to know that even some Democrats are starting to see the lunacy of this and say, hey, we don't want socialism in our party. You know, we talked about this before on the podcast. The Democratic Socialists of America came out not too long ago with a very clear, direct statement about what they want to do to the U.S. government. Right now, we have 3 co-equal branches of government. And yes, sometimes they encroach on one another and do things that they shouldn't. But for the most part, the checks and balances that these 3 branches provide are what keep America America. They're what separate America from so many other nations. And as I've already talked about in the first discussion that we had today, they keep us from the dangers of socialism. You know, one of the things that the socialists tout is universal health care. But I was just reading about universal health care in Canada, a Facebook thread about this issue, and someone was talking about their friend with breast cancer getting scheduled for a doctor's appointment and waiting 2 or 3 months for that doctor's appointment to happen. Then the doctor orders a biopsy and waiting 2 or 3 months before the biopsy happens, and all this drawn out time frame between doctor's appointments that happen because of socialized medicine. So there are prices to be paid. And I remember a story several years ago where a Canadian official came to the U.S. for heart surgery. And I've always thought about that. And I've thought about the fact that this is the price of socialism. Yes, you may not pay a financial price for having socialized medicine, for having universal health care, but you may very well pay a health price because of the time that it takes you to get into the doctor. Not to mention that the places where euthanasia are allowed, assisted suicide, they may say that it's your choice and they're not going to force you to do it. But I have heard stories, both in Oregon, where it's available in the United States, and in Canada, where insurance companies have literally determined that someone is not treatable or is not worth treating. And then the insurance company has said, we don't want to pay for you to get continued treatment, but we would be willing to pay for you to kill yourself. And the reason that I said euthanasia and assisted suicide is because the line between the two is not that. I heard 2 sad stories about assisted suicide just this past year as well. There was a 17-year-old girl, and I'm not clear on the details, but she was raped, and she was dealing with depression. I believe this was the UK, if not somewhere else in Europe. And she opted for assisted suicide rather than getting treated for her depression and being helped through it. Now, granted, one of the worst things that could ever happen to you is to be raped. I can't imagine that kind of personal violation. But it is very sad that this physically healthy 17-year-old got to the place where she thought that suicide was the only option. Another such story, again, I'm not sure the exact place, but I know somewhere in Europe, there were two elderly ladies. I think they were in their mid-80s. They were twins. One of them was very sick with cancer or some other terminal illness and wanted to end her life. Now, I will admit that these are the most compelling arguments for such a thing. It makes sense from a human perspective that if you are in immense physical pain, you just want relief, and ending it all seems like the way to go. But the twist of this story is that the healthy twin did not want to live without her sister, and so she chose to end her life by assisted suicide at the very same time. So I say all this to just put before you some of the aspects that are at stake if we allow a socialist agenda to take over the United States. And that's not even to mention the fact that the socialist agenda purports to give everybody the same thing and thus pull everybody up. But what it actually does is it pulls everybody down, because there's no longer incentive for people working hard. Why would I go work hard at my 9 to 5 if Sally over here literally goes on Facebook or YouTube and says to the world, and I have literally seen a video like this past week, says to the world, essentially, I'm fat, I'm lazy, and I don't want to work. And for good measure, they threw in something about their sexual orientation. As if that matters in these topics. But imagine living in a world where the people that don't want to work get the money of the hardworking people. And they somehow get the same amount of money that the hardworking people get. That's not a sustainable way of life. The reality is that the beauty of capitalism is that if you work hard, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make something more of yourself. Here is the ultimate reality, is that the liberal people who cry the loudest about people being oppressed and about socialism being the answer are people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and made something of their life, and they would have much more power for good if they would just tell people how they can do that. Sonny Houston should not be sitting on The View talking about how bad it is to be black in America. Sonny Houston should be sitting on The View telling young ladies, particularly young ladies of color, since she cares so much about them, how they too can be lawyers, how they too can be a talk show host. Whoopi Goldberg, she talks about the caste system, how there's no way out. But she went from broke to billionaire because she pulled herself up by the bootstraps and because she was given the opportunity to succeed. Now, I could be wrong about the billionaire part, but I know she's at least in the high millions. These are rich people who have learned to succeed. And again, it would be much more beneficial to their fans if they would tell their fans, I worked hard, I got here because this is what I was motivated to do. You can do the same. That is what we need more of in America. We need people who are willing to push people to do hard things. Instead, by and large, we as Americans have become the victims of the soft bigotry of low expectations. We say to ourselves that we are helping people by not expecting too much of them. But here's the thing, if you shoot for an extremely high goal and you miss, then you've still probably accomplished more than if you had a low and manageable goal every day of your life. Because it is important to realize that failure is a part of success. If you study successful people in history, it is not in some ways their success that is most important to the story. Because the thing that led to their success is the many failures that happen along the way and the fact that they did not quit. This is something that if we want America to thrive, we must emphasize. People talk about the American dream, and it's a good thing. But the American dream must be accomplished by blood, sweat, and tears. When the founding fathers procured our freedom and gave us a nation, what did they do? They pledged their life, their fortune, and their sacred honor. That's a pretty big sacrifice. All so that you and I can sit in this free country and express ourselves the way we want to. And know that the freedom to do so is protected by the laws of the land. Good things to keep in mind. Well, I'm about to wrap up the show today. I really appreciate everyone for tuning in. Before I go, though, I want to share with you some encouragement from Lee Strobel.
I was a new Christian. I was still editor at a newspaper in Chicago. I was packing up to go home one day, and I felt the Holy Spirit in a very specific way nudging me to go into the business office of the newspaper and invite my atheist friend to come to Easter services at our church. So I went up to him. I said, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm doing great." I said, "You know, Easter's coming up." He said, "Strobel, you know I'm an atheist. I don't observe Easter." I said, yeah, I know, but Easter's when we remember the resurrection of Jesus. He said, "Oh, he wasn't resurrected." I said, "Well, actually, there's good evidence he was." He looked at me and said, "I don't want to go to your stupid church." I went out and I thought, what was that all about? Why did I feel so specifically compelled to go and invite him to Easter services, talk about the resurrection? I shared the gospel with him and he just shut me down. And I'm telling you, this bothered me for years because to this day, he's an atheist. Several years later, by then I'm a pastor, and a guy came up to me at church one day and he said, "Can I shake your hand and thank you for the spiritual influence you've had on my life?" I said, "It's real nice, but who are you?" So let me tell you my story. A few years ago, I lost my job. And the guy at the newspaper said, "Well, can you tile floors?" I said, "Yeah, I've tiled our bathroom. I can tile floors." He said, "We need some tile installed and repaired at the newspaper. If you can do that for a while, we can pay you." So I said, "Great." He said, "I went to work at the newspaper." He said, "One day, not long before Easter, I was in the business office of the newspaper. I was on my hands and knees working on the tile on the floor behind a big desk, and you walked in. I didn't even think you knew I was there. And you start talking to this guy about God. And you start talking about the evidence for the resurrection. And you start inviting him to church. And this guy was shutting you down. But I'm on my hands and knees listening to all this stuff, and my heart's beating fast, and I'm thinking, I need God. As soon as you left, I called my wife. I said, we're going to church this Easter. She said, what? I said, yeah. He said, we came to your church at Easter. I came to faith. My wife came to faith, and our teenage son came to faith. And I just wanted to thank you.
That is a very moving message from Lee Strobel. He is the author of The Case for Christ and some other follow-up books in that series. Lee is a very outspoken believer, and he was an atheist who set out to prove the Bible wrong. But on his journey to prove the Bible wrong, he met Jesus and everything changed. And what strikes me about that story is that God directed him to share Christ with a coworker and to invite him to church. That coworker totally rejected him. And as he relates in this little clip, that coworker, at least as of that recording, still rejects Christ and is an atheist. And he walked away from that encounter not understanding why God had asked him to do that when this guy was so unreceptive to the faith. But he didn't realize that there was a tile guy behind the wall or the desk, as the case may be, listening to this message. And he heard it loud and clear, was convicted, came to church, got saved, his wife got saved, and his son got saved. All because Lee Strobel went and shared a message with someone who had no intention of accepting it. And I think that's such a good lesson for all of us to be obedient to the heavenly voice of God. Because sometimes the things that God asks us to do don't make sense. As a matter of fact, if you are strongly compelled to do something that makes no sense, there's a good possibility that it's God telling you to do it. But if we do this thing that God has clearly called us to that makes no sense, He can give us a blessing. Now, one thing that I think about is Lee Strobel obviously heard the end of the story, got a chance to meet this guy at his church, and this guy got a chance to thank him on this earth. But I believe there are things happening around us on this earth that we won't necessarily even know this side of heaven. But when we get to heaven, we will realize why something happened or why God asked us to do something, and there will be fruit that we know not of. So I hope that that encourages you this week. I hope that this whole podcast episode has done that, and that if it has, you will share it with your family and friends, as I mentioned, and that you will let other people know how they can find Speaking for Him and get the hope and encouragement of Jesus as a result. Please also share your comments, questions, and concerns with the contact information that's about to roll at the end of the show. And with that being said, have a great week and keep serving the best of masters.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Your host has been Andrew Gomison, founder of Speaking for Him. For information on today's show and to leave us comments and voicemails, please visit Speaking for Him. That is speaking numeral for him.blogspot.com. You can find Andrew's ministry at speakingforhim.com. That's speaking the number 4 HIM.com. And when you look for us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or all other major podcast platforms, let us know what you think of the podcast by leaving a rating and a review. Intro music for this podcast is provided by Audio Kraken. Transition music is provided by Superstate. Both of these tracks are available free of charge from pond5.com, pond5.com.